turn to our text, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I'll go ahead and apologize to you. As soon as I say amen, I've got to run upstairs for a funeral. For those of you that are like me and you're avid obituary readers, you know that already. But, I'll disappear as soon as we wrap up. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And by the way, this is the last meeting. If you get my emails, you saw this and you read this. Of course, this is the last meeting. We break for holidays because next Wednesday is the night before Thanksgiving. We don't really do dinners or things around here on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We do have our regular Vesper service in the chapel at 5:30 p.m. The evening before Thanksgiving, because worship, and we don't ever cancel stuff like that. We worship, we pray, and particularly next Wednesday night, we offer thanks to God to make sure it really is a Thanksgiving that we celebrate. And then I'm breaking for the rest of the holidays. We've got about 250 people, I think, right now signed up to participate in our small group studies around our Advent study. And again, if you receive my email, I actually included on that the link to go to our website. You can go to our website, it's easy to find, to sign up for one of those smaller groups that suits your time, suits your schedule. Great opportunity to go deeper with God and with other people. Relationship, it's all about relationship. Relationship first and foremost with God, and then relationship with other people. So we need to make sure that we're doing both of those well. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to look at the first 16 verses, which means when we regather in January, we will begin at verse 17. And I expect you to be half my memory in case I forget where we regather. But we're going to do the first 16 verses. This whole chapter is Paul dealing with topics surrounding marriage. So it's a very interesting text. It's not well known because people in our culture don't read the Bible very much. It's not well known. I think the other reason it's not well known, particularly in this kind of issue, marriage, divorce, sexuality, sexual relationships, our culture doesn't like anybody interfering with what they feel. So, they just choose not to read stuff like this, which is probably a more important reason why we should read stuff like this. In our culture, we just want to do what we feel like doing, and we don't really care what God thinks is right for us to do. So just to whet your appetite, and we'll go back through it verse by verse, let me offer you the whole text. And some of you in worship, if you do happen to worship here on Sunday mornings, some of you heard me do a little bit of this past Sunday. Chapter 7, verse 1, 1 Corinthians. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote. He's talking to the church, the Christians at Corinth. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Verse 6, Paul says, now as a concession, not a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Verse 12, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But, verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you'll save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now that Paul has your attention, we'll go back through this text and make sure we hear what Paul is saying. Lots of discussion in our culture about marriage and divorce and who to have sex with and who not to have sex with, and we are sex obsessed. So lots of discussion in our culture. I wish Paul would get a few words in occasionally. So let's go back to the text. Make sure you're reading what Paul has sent to the church. Verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, if you were here with us last week, you noticed, because it was in last week's text, I hope your translation, now we all understand there are no quotation marks, no punctuation in Greek. So anytime we translate from any language into English, but anytime we translate from Greek into English, your translators are helping you understand. So most contemporary translations, such as the one in front of me, the ESV, English Standard Version, the phrase, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, you see some quotation, hopefully, if not, I'm going to tell you they should, but we know they should be there. You see quotation marks around that phrase? How many of your Bibles have quotation marks around that phrase? Hope you did not miss the quotation marks. They're there for a reason. Just like what we looked at last week, Paul is quoting something back to the Corinthians that they have said in their correspondence. That's why it's important if you either understand, we strongly believe this is not something Paul says. This is something they have said to Paul, and we know that because we can read. He begins, the rest of this chapter is addressing that. So you've heard what they have written to Paul. Now let me just say a couple words about that concept. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Well, in the Greco-Roman world, there were philosophies that said being celibate, being single is the best of all possible choices. If you can't do the best, do the second best, which is marry. If you can't abstain, if you can't be celibate and abstain from sexual relationships, then do the second best, get married, and within the bounds of marriage. That's where sexual activity is allowed. Some people think the Christian church says that, by the way, but Paul, again, they haven't read 1 Corinthians 7 or much of the rest of the New Testament. You're going to see in a moment, marriage is wonderful, good gift from God. Sexual relationship, wonderful, good gift from God. Singleness, let me start with singleness. Singleness is a gift from God. Now, again, this is clear Bible. It's not always clear in the church. If you're here Sunday, you heard me give my illustration of that one. When I'm 22 years old and I'm leaving a Roman Catholic environment where I've been trained and educated by Roman Catholics, I was surrounded in a world there that highly esteemed singleness and celibacy. And to be clergy in that part of the Christian community, you can't you can't be married, because there were periods, the Roman Catholic Church does not say this now, but there were periods in Christian history, not just, word Catholic means universal. We were all just part of one church for 1,000 years. But even after we divided, we still run across this in churches, where some church people think that human sexual relationships are bad. It's sort of dirty, to be hidden. One thing, they've not read the Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs in the Old Testament. But they think that's, I remember, and it was a Catholic priest, a friend of mine, attacking the way some Christians, for long stretches of history, viewed human sexuality. And part of it we do attribute to one of our heroes, St. Augustine. And I remember this priest friend of mine saying, yeah, we kind of went off the rails after the New Testament. And by the time St. Augustine's writing in the 5th century, what he said and what some Christians embraced was, regarding human sexuality, well, if you've got to do it, but for God's sake, don't enjoy it. So we developed a whole theology that the holier way, such as what clergy do, the holier way is to be celibate and single. And that's why from about the year 400, 500 to the Protestant Reformation, we mandated celibacy for our clergy. Anyway, I came out of that world when I was in a Roman Catholic environment, and I go to Duke Divinity School, and I go to serve my first Methodist Protestant churches. And I showed up over here at a wonderful church in southeast Guilford County. Was there 3 years as an intern trying to learn something about church life. And I told the congregation Sunday, when I went there, it's like they had a committee, a secret committee formed to make sure that every young Duke intern that served that church left with a wife. And by the way, I did. Her name's Tammy. That's why my burial spot is in that church cemetery over there. So they were successful. I always kind of felt there was a committee orchestrating this. Because in the Protestant world, if you're Protestant, I'm showing you the two extremes. In the Protestant world, you almost don't expect, you don't expect, and I'm not sure you completely trust single clergy. And I remember when I was in that internship and everybody was trying to introduce me to their daughters, I got a lot of invitations to come to homes for dinner, and they all seemed to have young daughters. At that same time, when I was 22, 23, I went to visit. Somebody took me to visit the Methodist bishop at that time in this conference. Great man, Bishop L. Scott Allen. And I'd heard rumors about him as a bishop, and he confirmed them when I went to see him. He asked me 2 questions. I was wanting him to ask me about the difference between John Wesley and John Calvin. I was wanting him to ask me about my theories of atonement. He asked me 2 questions. Do you accept the Methodist itinerancy? And if you don't know that language, that means, will you go where sent? And his second question to me, and I said, yes, sir, to that one. His second question to me was, are you married? I said, no, sir, I'm only 22, I think, or 23 at the time. And his response to me was, you need to get married. If you'll get married before I leave the Episcopal office as bishop, I will officiate at your service for free. Yeah, and the Protestant world is almost problematic to not be married. Now, what really became interesting was when Protestant clergy, that was supposed to solve all the problems, to marry a wife who would follow you in the Methodist itinerancy and, play the piano and help sweep the church. But then what started happening, clergy started marrying other clergy. We had clergy couples. That was a bigger problem for the appointment process than a single clergy. Anyway, just to show you that within the Christian community, we have presuppositions about somehow that celibacy is better than marriage, or marriage is better than celibacy. By the way, to show you how things change, I am going to get through this text, show you how things changed. When I entered the ministry, which it really wasn't the Dark Ages. It wasn't that long ago. It seemed like yesterday in some ways. I had to take a vow. It's no longer there now. It's been removed. But a vow I had to take to be ordained in the tradition that ordained me, in 1985, I had to take a vow to accept and support celibacy in singleness and fidelity in marriage. You know what that means. If you're single, celibacy. If you're married, faithful. That was not controversial in 1985. It started becoming controversial. That's just the classic Christian stand that we used to always say we believed. And I know there were popes and great leaders in the Christian community, both Protestant and Catholic, that had illegitimate children. I mean, you can find, our gold standards here, we've not always met our gold standard in a relationship. Well, we at least used to know when I came into the ministry, our gold standard, celibacy and singleness and faithfulness in marriage. That was not controversial because the Bible really strongly teaches that. That became controversial and it is now removed from the book of discipline, that tradition. Because all of a sudden what developed, to get us into Paul, what developed is, I don't want to use the word theology, but any way you think about God is theology. What developed instead of the traditional biblical Christian view is, well, doesn't God want me to be happy? You know, I'm not married to somebody of another gender, but doesn't God want me to be happy? I have certain sexual feelings. Doesn't God want me to be happy? You know, I know you've heard me say this. My kids heard ad nauseum when they were growing up. God is more concerned about your holiness than your happiness. Nothing opposed to happiness, but we do in this culture. We bow before the altar, and if I use happiness, I'm using it like John Wesley and Aristotle. That's not the way our culture uses it. They would use the word happiness to say you find the virtuous life, and that brings true happiness. That brings human flourishing. In this culture, happiness means sensation, sensuality, pleasure, comfort, having a good time. So I've almost banished the word happiness from my vocabulary. I'm more about joy or happiness in the way that John Wesley, the Christian community, up until recent years, and Aristotle used it. But that's not a valid argument. Well, doesn't God want me to be happy? That may not be there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not the supreme goal in life. As Christians, I hope we know the supreme goal is we want to hear Him say to us one day, well done, good and faithful servant. He's not going to say, hope you had a happy time down there. Now, again, you know the culture as well as I do. You probably know it better than I do. My family reminds me of that all the time. You know the culture in which we live. So now I hope you're ready to pick up what Paul says. And he does begin what Jesus said about marriage and human sexuality. But I hope you noticed in the first read through, like in regards to divorce, he added a third reason for divorce. Hope you notice that as I teach you to read what's in front of you, but I'll make it clear in just a moment. Paul did add a third reason for divorce. So that's the question. They're doing evidently things that Paul would say was wrong, weird, freaky, unhealthy regarding marriage. So what they wrote to him was just saying, well, Paul, isn't it always good in all circumstances forever and ever for a man not to touch a woman or have sexual relationships with a woman? The Greek there literally says touch, yes, but that's why the modern translation says their question or their statement, their declaration, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Well, here comes Paul's answer to that. Here comes Paul speaking into their culture, their society, and they probably more heavily over-sexualized than we as a culture are. So there's no church in the New Testament that's more like our church today than the church in Corinth. So here's Paul's answers. But because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have. The word have there is not like possess. The word there is really, and we know this from the rest of the big book in front of me. It's like a Greek and Hebrew euphemism for have sex. So he says, but because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have sex with his own wife, and each woman should have sex with her own husband. So here he's already putting boundaries. He's saying sex, okay, within boundaries. Sex, okay, within boundaries. Verse 3. Now watch this, and watch the equality that Paul is speaking into the first century Greco-Roman world. He's doing it in a startling way. But notice what he says here. Verse 3. The husband should give to his wife. Now, my more contemporary translation says conjugal rights. I love the way the King James translates it. The due benevolence. But unless you don't know what that meant in 1611, didn't know what it meant from the Greek, when it says when it says that the husband should give to his wife her due benevolence, we just put conjugal rights. And that means you give to your, and he's going to talk to husbands in a minute. He's going to talk to wives in a minute. You have to give to your spouse her at this point, her conjugal rights, her due benevolence. In other words, give her the affection and the sexual intimacy that goes with being married. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and watch this, and likewise the wife to her husband. The first century world knew all about the male's rights, the men's rights. They had the right to do everything and get everything and get all the pleasure they wanted. They were the ones that even had the right to divorce in many places. Again, you're going to see Paul lay it equally on both husband and wife here. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. Remember we talked last week when Paul, and this may be why he's on this tangent, he talked about you are not your own. You have been bought with a price. Remember he said that at the end of chapter 6. We are not our own. We've been bought with a price. We don't have the right to pro-choice for anything. I don't even have, if I'm married, my body doesn't just belong to me. My body never belongs to me. It belongs first to God, and then if you get married, I hope you understand, talk to me before you marry. I'll help you understand it. When you get married, your body's not, first you give your body to God. You get married, your body belongs to your spouse. Now again, talk about something that's countercultural here. That's because we want to be all about what I want, when I want it, how I want it. Local, personal autonomy, self-fulfillment. We know our culture. But notice what Paul says. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. An amazing equality there. He just lifted wives amazingly up. Verse 4, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. The two shall become one. That's the foundation for marriage in Genesis 2. You leave your husband and you leave your father and your mother and you cleave to your husband or your wife, and the two become one. That's why in Ephesians 5, Paul uses the example of marriage to illustrate the relationship between Christ and his church. Anyway, look at verse 5. After he said, you're not your own, you don't have authority over your body, your spouse does. Look at verse 5. Do not deprive one another. Now, in case you've nodded off, we're talking about sex here in marriage. Verse 5, do not deprive one another. And watch this, except perhaps by an agreement, it's got to be mutually agreed to, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time. For why? Why would you do this? That you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. The Bible is very realistic about human nature. We are built with a certain impulse. We either control it. We don't like to control any passions in our culture. We either control the passions we have, or we allow them to be used within certain boundaries. So, he's not saying be married. And some of the Corinthians were saying this. Maybe some who had just come to Christ because of some Greek philosophies like Epicureanism. Epicureanism taught no sex, no marriage, nothing. Some of the Corinthians were making assumptions here with Paul, and that's why he says, have sexual relationships within marriage. It's part of the marriage. That's what we Christians call the consummation of the marriage. I assume you know that. If the marriage is not consummated, it can be annulled in the life of the church. Because the purpose of marriage, all things being equal, the primary purpose, there may be another one, the primary purpose of marriage, Jesus said this about as strongly as he could, and this is why we don't do marriage in heaven. The primary purpose, you're talking about being countercultural, the primary purpose of marriage is what? Procreation. So again, all the Christian package fits together very neatly. Particularly people will pay attention. We didn't just invent this stuff in the 1950s. Your parents didn't invent it in the 1950s just to make sure you never had a good time. I mean, the Christian package fits together neatly. So yeah, you do what normal husband and wives do unless you mutually agree upon the season of prayer. And he says, don't let that season be too long, because Paul understands, we understand human nature. Because you may go out, and if you're in Corinth, you may go out and visit a temple prostitute. Bad idea. That was last week. Okay, verse 6. Now as a concession. Now as a concession to human weakness is what he's saying. Again, the Bible is very realistic about human nature. Now as a concession, not as a command, I say this. And by the way, the concession there, and even ESV, I don't think does the paragraph break in the right place. The concession there is the concession that he just made in verse 5. Have a normal sexual relationship unless you break for a season of prayer. That's his concession. Now as a concession, not as a command, I say what I just said. Now he goes on really to a different topic in verse 7. I wish that all were as I myself. What's Paul's marital status when he wrote this letter? He is single. He just told you that when I read the whole text. So he says, now, I wish that all were as I myself am. Let me read and I'll get through where he says he's single. But each has his own gift. Both are gifts. Again, I'm not sure some Christians get that. When I waffle between the Catholic and the Protestant worlds, they'd seem to think one gift's better than the other, depending on which world I'm in. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So both marriage and singleness are gifts. Now look at verse 8. To the unmarried and the widows. Paul's smart. He's not being redundant here. So the unmarried is one category and the widows are a second category. Or he wouldn't use two words here. So we know what widows are, those who are not married because of death. We know Paul's going to talk about virgins later. We know what a virgin is. They have not yet married or had sexual relationships because of whatever reasons. So they're pre-married. Widows are post-married. The unmarried are the in-between. And Paul uses this phrase in 1 Corinthians. So the unmarried are those who used to be, but are not now. And the Greco-Roman, and particularly the Jewish world of the first century, divorce was easier then. Well, the divorce was easier then than it was in the United States up through the 1970s. We sort of illustrate divorce is pretty easy to get now, just like it was in the Greco-Roman world, and particularly in the Jewish world. Divorce was not difficult in the ancient world. So when here in the unmarried, he's talking about those who, for whatever reason now, are not married. They may have been married, the unmarried, because he's going to talk about widows and virgins later. But he's talking to all these people that are single, whatever state they may, for whatever reason they're single. He's saying, I say to you, it is good for them to remain single as I am. Again, you see he's single. Now later in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's going to talk about why it may be good to be single. And what he gives you there, and we'll get there in January, he gives you the same argument my Roman Catholic priest friends give me, that I would have more freedom and independence for ministry in the life of the church if I didn't have family demands. So again, I'm glad he says that later because we know what he's saying. He's not saying, I wish you were single like I am, because that's the higher, holier state. Again, he's already made it clear it's not. That both singleness or celibacy, when I say singleness, the assumption is celibacy. That was the assumption with the vow that I had to take 40 years ago. Single meant celibate. But whether, singleness / celibacy or married are both gifts, and one's not better than the other. By the way, if you want to see a world, and you need to know this because of what Paul's saying and because of what you know about Jesus, if you want to see a world that is, I told you about going to a Protestant church over here in Greensboro, they're all trying to marry me off. If you want to see a religious community that is obsessive about marrying, go hang out with some Orthodox Jews. It is a sin to not, they used to say it's a sin to not marry by the age of 20. They give you a little wiggle room on that one now. But particularly, I'm going to say this in a minute about why we know Paul is single, but Paul might have been married because he's coming out of a Jewish world. Most of us think, if those who take the New Testament seriously, we believe he was married at one point. He's not now. So, and that's going to come up in the text in a few minutes. But particularly in the Jewish world, being married was essential, which is why you had outliers. You had people who just refused to do that, and everybody noticed, like the Essenes down at Qumran or Jesus of Nazareth. It created, if Jesus, I'm going back to the Da Vinci Code. Y'all remember that? If Jesus had been married, we would have put it on every page of the New Testament, because it was a problem for us that our guy wasn't married. That's why people made it up that he was married. If they need, he married Mary Magdalene. Yeah, the fact that he was unmarried was very countercultural. Go talk to some Jews today. Very countercultural for him not to have married. Which is why we are sure historically he was not married. You don't make up stuff that makes a problem for everybody. Like a virgin birth or a single rabbi who's your rabbi. So yeah, Jesus was not married. The Essenes down in Qumran, outside Jerusalem, near the Dead Sea, they were a community of non-married Jews. But yeah, we just do that. We either highly esteem marriage or highly esteem singleness, which is probably why. It may not be your experience, but I've run across a lot of people in 40 years. If they're not married, guess what they want? To get married. And that's not bad. I run across some people who are married. Guess what they want? To not be married. Just, wouldn't it be amazing if we learned how to be satisfied? Paul says in verse 17, be satisfied with whatever station in life God has called you to and to which God has assigned you. Again, we make ourselves so unhappy in so many ways. But anyway, so Paul, the reason we think Paul was married, by the way, at some point, and he's going to mention it again, I think he illustrates his situation later in the text that we're looking at this morning. He's Jewish. He was trained in Jerusalem. We know most of this from the book of Acts. He was trained in Jerusalem under Gamaliel. So he was trained as a rabbi. I promise you he was married. He was trained as a rabbi. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. It looks that way in the book of Acts because he mentions, or Paul mentions on his behalf, or Luke mentions on Paul's behalf in the book of Acts, that he cast votes. He cast his vote. Go look at chapter 26, book of Acts. He cast his vote to persecute Christians. So he's like on the Sanhedrin. And then remember him at the martyrdom of Stephen, the first killing of a Christian in Jerusalem. He's kind of there overseeing it. The way the text says, the people who are stoning Stephen lay their cloaks at the feet of Saul. That's how you're introduced to Paul in the book of Acts. He's standing there almost overseeing the stoning of Stephen. That's why I say, we know he's a rabbi. We are pretty convinced he's a member of the Sanhedrin. And when you look at his activity about casting votes and then going to Damascus to find some and help in participating in the martyrdom of Stephen, it's like he was the attorney general of the Sanhedrin. So I have no doubt he was married. And people who look at the text seriously know he was married. So then, what should inquiring minds ask? Where's his wife at now? He's single. On his ministry, his missionary journeys, his writing of his letters, it's clear he's single. So yeah, you should ask, where's his wife at? Well, now this is speculation. She could have died. She could have died. I'm not sure because of what he's getting ready to say in a minute. I'm not sure. This is speculation, but we are seeing how he adds another option to divorce in just a moment. His wife could have left him when he became Christian, when he became a Christ follower. Not only said, I'm going to become a Christ follower and I'm going to spend the rest of my life running all around the Mediterranean world. You want to go, honey? You know, I've got a book of discipline. I've given it to the church now. It's in the museum. I've got a book of discipline from 1820 in the Methodist Church. For a Methodist preacher in 1820 to get married, we had to have the vote and the approval of all of our clergy colleagues in the annual conference. Because we were circuit riders. You know, if I got married, chances were strong. My wife didn't want to get on the back of my horse. So what that usually meant in early Methodism was we lost a preacher. They became, in our language, they became located. And we still use the word, they still use the word local pastors. That doesn't mean they hang out locally. It means they're located. They don't itinerate. So I'm not sure, particularly when I'm getting ready to show you what Paul says, and you can read as well as I can, what Paul says when he adds a third option to divorce, that he's not maybe letting us know. That's what happened to his wife. She left him. Anyway, but we know he's not married at this point. So look at verse 10. Let's go back there. To the married, I give this charge, not I. Well, after he says, stay single, verse 9, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. It's better. By the way, the Greek there says in your King James, or some of your translations show us, the end of verse 9, for it is better to marry than to burn. If King James, you got with passion in italics, right? You with me? Or your translation, maybe New American Standard, has with passion in italics. Hope if you're using that Bible, you know why some words are in italics. It's because we've added those words to help you understand what it means. Paul just said, for it's better to marry than to burn. Now, there's been times, I don't think he means burn in hell. So most of us that deal with the text, we don't think he means burn in hell, so we're helping you out here. Burn with passion. So we add the words with passion. It's better to marry than to burn. Because again, sexual desire is not wrong, but it's limited. Well, let me show you something else I just ran over quickly. But I didn't have to say this before about 10 years ago. The sexual activity is limited within marriage. And the big thing now, go back to verse 2 for just a moment. I never had to point this out until recent years. Verse 2, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each wife her own husband. What's he ruling out there for the Greeks that we need to rule out now in our culture again? You get one wife. You have your own one wife with whom you have sexual relationship. You have your own one husband with whom you have sexual relationship. The ancient world knew polygamy. In our modern world, they don't call it polygamy, because that kind of sounds weird. Mormons get in trouble because they tried to do polygamy till they wanted to become part of the United States and it was illegal. So we don't use the word polygamy. The word that's used now, you know, I do this occasionally. My family know that I'm cooler than they think they are, than they think I am. I do pay attention a little bit to the culture around me. The word now is polyamorous or polyamory, multiple loves. Or the new word is that I'm hearing, thruples. I'm not a couple, I'm a thruple. That's just stupid to me. One life is one wife. I mean, Paul already says marriage and family can complicate your life, take away some freedom, take away some independence. Multiple wives? I don't even want one more. I don't want a throuple. But our culture has gone. By the way, I saw a case recently where someone married. There's no legal jurisdiction that will enforce this, but someone married an AI-created spouse. Now, of course, there's no legal jurisdiction because they think about, and of course, the person who's arguing for that is saying, "This, I know that you know this. I know you think this is weird and unusual and strange. My family does. It's a perfect spouse. He asks me how my day has gone every time I come home. He's perfect. He's wonderful. You may think this is weird, but it's going to become more common." And I'm like, probably so. Probably so. Paul's brain would explode over that one. But you'll notice he limits you to one spouse in verses 2 and 3. He limits you to sex. If you're going to do sex, it's got to be within the bounds of marriage, husband and wife. So verse 10 now, we got to move on. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. And here's where he quotes Jesus, because he's going to add something to Jesus. He says, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord says this. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Well, you know what Jesus said about divorce. You don't divorce except for adultery, and you don't remarry. Jesus said that. Now, some of you, I do the same thing. Every now and again, I go to the Bible and try to find some loopholes. Paul does add a third. He says, that's why he says, start with, I know what Jesus said. And again, the New Testament Gospels are not written at this point, so it's oral tradition. He has been told, he's been trained. He knows what Jesus said about marriage. But then, verse 2, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. Here's where he's going to have to deal with another issue. Jesus never had to deal with the issue Paul's getting ready to deal with. Jesus was teaching almost all of the time to Jews and Jews only when he's in the Galilee and Judea. He's talking to Jews and Jews only. So, this Jew marries this Jew. Now, if he would go, like he did occasionally in the Gospels, go across the Jordan to the Decapolis, those 10 pagan cities, he was talking to pagans and pagans only. But now who's Paul having to talk to in Corinth? He's a missionary. He's going around the world. He's inviting people to become Christian, and people are accepting the invitation. So all of a sudden, Paul's got a reality Jesus never had to deal with. You got a Christian spouse and an unchristian spouse. It still happens today. Jesus did not have to deal with that in his Jewish world. It was Jew to Jew, Jew to Jew, Jew to Jew. Well, here's Paul having to deal with one spouse becoming Christian and the other one not. This is where I said I think we get a hint here with what he's getting ready to say as to Paul's being previously married and what happened to his wife. Anyway, that's why Paul adds a third. Well, here are your three. And again, this is the gold standard. None of us meet the gold standard. The Bible, complete Bible, Jesus and Paul, there's three ways to get out of a marriage. The right ways, Paul's going to give you quite a bit of wiggle room here that you may be comfortable with. Hesitant to give this to many people because we probably need to go to the other extreme and say, kind of try to be married. But Paul does say there's three reasons now. Death, till death do us part. I had one couple in 40 years who told me to remove that from their vows. And I did, because I had already said to them, I will strengthen your vows, I will not weaken them. Well, they wanted me to strengthen their vows. They wanted to stay married and not have it severed by death. I thought it unwise, but I done told them I'd strengthen their vows, but I made sure they knew what they were taking a vow to. But death severs a marriage. Adultery severs a marriage. Paul's getting ready to add a third one. Desertion or abandonment. That's why I look at verse 12 and we'll read this and get out of here. To the rest, I say, I not the Lord, because he just told you in verses 10 and 11 and what the Lord says. But here in verse 12, he's going to tell you what he also says. To the rest, I say that if a brother a Christian, has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. So if you're married to a pagan who won't embrace your new faith, and he or she will stay with you, stay with them. He's going to tell you why in a minute. Verse 13, if any woman has a husband who is not, he's very egalitarian here. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and this is probably more common in our culture, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Now, why do you hang in there? Because he's getting ready to tell you you don't have to at a certain point. But why would you hang in there for any season? Look what he says, verse 13. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, he should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband, now the text really says, but it takes a little explanation, which is why your translation may translate it differently. Verse 14 says, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife. Is saved because of his wife. We know that, we're saved by faith. We're saved by grace, faith in Jesus Christ. It's just like when Paul in 1 Timothy, I believe, talks about women being saved through childbirth. You're not saved by faith in Christ or by having a baby. He's talking about just being saved from, delivered. You make it through childbirth. We know how you're saved. So he's not saying that, somehow if you have a pagan spouse, they kind of are saved, personal salvation because of you. So a better way to be made holy is optional. What he's saying here is if you're the Christian in the family, hopefully you have some influence. Hopefully some of God's grace given to you will spill over on your non-believing spouse, and even, he's going to say, will spill over on your children. That's why he says, for the unbelieving husband is influenced with holiness because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is influenced because of the holiness of her husband. Watch this, otherwise the children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy, which, by the way, and this is a whole other discussion, for those of us in the majority tradition of the church that baptizes infants, we have lots of reasons for that. If you want a verse, here's one of the verses. I will baptize an infant as long as at least one of the parents is a believing person. Anyway, because the parents have spiritual influence. And hopefully if you have a Christian person in the home, a spouse, hopefully the grace will spill over onto the other spouse and onto the children. But look at verse 15. He's made you probably uncomfortable long enough. Look at verse 15. And this is why I think he's talking autobiographically. But if the unbelieving partner separates, what does he say? Let her go. Let him go. Let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God had, now again, don't take this to extremes. And notice he doesn't say God has called you to happiness. God has called you to what? Peace. I do tell couples. So again, Paul is saying abandonment or desertion is okay reason for divorce. If your unbelieving spouse leaves you. Now, I will, Paul's a friend of mine. I'll ask him when I get there one day, but I'm going to speak a little bit for Paul right now. Just like adultery, because I've had to do this over the last 40 years, there is physical adultery. There's also emotional adultery. Yeah, if your best friend is someone of the opposite sex with whom you say all the stuff you should be saying to your wife, you notice when I say conjugal rights, that's sexuality and affection. So it's not just adultery when the clothes come off. There is emotional adultery, I think. A lot of us think. You can ask Jesus one day if it's just physical adultery. But particularly if I allow for that, there's desertion and abandonment from a non-believing spouse who does not share your values, share your faith. I'm not so sure that desertion and abandonment, I'm not sure that always, this is where I'm speaking for Paul, and at least I'm leaving it an option. It has to be deeply discerned. I'm not sure that person can't be living in the house with you and not have deserted you or abandoned you. You with me? Now, again, I'm hesitant to say this to a culture because people are looking for a lot of loopholes. But I think we have them here. And I think Paul's wife did this to him because we know he had to be married. He never talks about widows and says, by the way, I'm one of them. But right here, he is adding to what Jesus said. When he says, if you're married to an unbelieving spouse and that unbelieving spouse deserts or abandons you, let them go, for God has called you to peace. Which is why, some of my clergy friends disagree with me on this. With couples over the last 40 years, I've said all the time, I want to help you put together a Christian marriage. If I cannot help, if we, after much prayer, discernment, not quick, if it becomes abundantly clear, I can't help you put together a Christian marriage, which, by the way, it is Paul who says in 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be unequally yoked. So I do ask couples, tell me about your religious faith. Tell me about your relationship with Jesus Christ. Don't marry someone, but in Paul's world, he's a missionary. He's leading people to Christ. So lo and behold, guess what? He ends up with marriages who one believes, one doesn't. But you certainly shouldn't head into a marriage with someone, if you're a believer, with someone who's not. Paul makes that clear later. But I always say to couples, if I cannot help you put together a Christian marriage, please let me help you put together a Christian divorce. Now, I'm not sure which is harder. Putting together a Christian marriage takes a lot of work. But putting together a Christian divorce takes a lot of work too. Paul says, let them go, for God has called you to peace. I see some people who separate and head to divorce. They would do everything but kill the children and burn the house down on the way out. So what Paul says here is very relevant to us in our culture today. God has called you to peace. Again, you don't take this lifeboat too quickly. But at some point, I would probably encourage you to take the lifeboat. If you cannot put together a Christian marriage that involves no type of adultery, that involves no type of desertion and abandonment, where the two really do become one, then it is that's why in the Roman Catholic Church, by the way, they don't do divorce. What they say is, and I've helped with this process, they do an annulment because what they will say is, that was never a Christian marriage. It was never a Christian marriage. You might have gone before 4 justices of the peace and had 3 wedding ceremonies and spent $100,000, but not sure it's a Christian marriage. Well, that's why if you go through that annulment process, and I've been involved in these, they will come back and ask who officiated. They will ask the wedding party. They will want to know what did you watch when this wedding was taking place? Did you watch a marriage being celebrated, or is it just a wedding? I've done 500 weddings now. I'll close on this because this will tweak your interest. I've done 500 weddings now. Only one time did a bride call me the day after and say, do you have to turn the marriage license in? You know what the legal answer is, by the way? Yes. If I have done a display of a wedding, otherwise it's fraud. If I marry this couple in front of all of you and y'all go out and you think Joe and Jane's married, and all of a sudden, because I've had people want me to do quasi-fake weddings, that's illegal too. That's why in the state of North Carolina, you cannot do a marriage without a marriage license. I can't show you something that looks like a marriage, and between the 3 of us, no, it's not. So I had to tell that poor bride, and it did not end well. I had to tell that poor bride, because it's been celebrated publicly, the law of the state is, I had to send it in. I did figure out at that point why her sister did not want to be one of the witnesses. and signed the document. I wish I'd been paying more of attention. She made a joke about why she didn't want to sign the document. I wish she'd have said, stop. But yeah, I learned later when the next day the bride calls me and wonders if I can not send the marriage. Because when you go to the courthouse, you filled out all your paperwork, you're finished, you're done. You just bring that marriage license to me, and I just have 10 days after I do something. I have 10 days to turn it in to tell the state it actually happened. So yeah, after I see it happen, I have to tell the state it happened. I can't put a sticky note on it and say, well, they changed their mind the next day, because X number of people have seen it. But their adultery or desertion or abandonment, those are issues for divorce. Some ways we say it in the Christian Jewish world, marriage is you become one when you are not one anymore. If you were, hopefully you were at some point. If you're not one anymore, that may be desertion or abandonment. Somebody bailed out. So again, I had to tell, those of us in the Christian church who will work with divorced people and redo marriages, it's not because we're a bunch of slackers. I hope. I know it's not because I'm a slacker. I've read the book. And I see Paul talking here about abandonment and desertion. If they bail out on you, and again, I'll ask Paul one day, does that mean a spouse who is relationally bailed out on you? Because that's not being one. That's not a marriage. Paul might would say, well, I can't imagine, but yes, if that happens, that's one of the three criteria. If you add Paul to Jesus, adultery, death, adultery, desertion / abandonment, whatever. So that's probably more than you bargained for. Look at verse 16, because that closes the paragraph. For how do you know, wife, when he's kind of saying why you hang out for a while with your unbelieving spouse. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save or sanctify or influence your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your life? We'll start at verse 17, but look at verse 17 as a conclusion. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. So singleness is a gift. Marriage is a gift. Don't drive yourself crazy trying to find another assignment or another gift in life. Don't go looking for that other calling or that other assignment or to switch gifts unless you are pretty clear that God is calling you. If you're single, this is why you can't get married here unless you come talk to me 3 times. Because if I'm going to officiate, I want to make sure God is calling you to marriage. I don't want you just to be in love with the idea of being married. I don't want you to be in love with the idea of having a really nice wedding ceremony in our sanctuary. I want to make sure you're being called to marriage. Because again, don't change your assignment from God too quickly. You're calling from God. And again, particularly if you're married and you want to go the other direction, it holds true that way too. Make sure whatever you're called to do, be in life, Paul's saying, it's a gift. Make the most of it. And as with all gifts, this can be, if you have a gift of being the greatest golfer in High Point, that can be one of your greatest joys. It can destroy your life and your marriage and your family and your kids. I tell people I say you do realize marriage can be your greatest joy or your greatest misery. It's how we do this and what we mean by marriage. So it is, as I've stopped, because I got a funeral to do. In this culture, it should be concerning to every one of us who are Christian, who value this book, value our 2,000 years of tradition. The world around us is having lots of conversation about a topic that we invented. At least let Paul, well, don't even say us, let Paul and Jesus at least be able to weigh in on these topics. If you're a Christian, let Paul and Jesus weigh in on these topics. Let's pray together. God, we're so grateful for your word, and we know that we experience you, we encounter you in your word. And we're so grateful that your word is an amazing guide for life. May your word influence us more than the world around us. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Have a wonderful holiday, Thanksgiving, Advent, Christmas. Join the small study.